In John Donne's poem, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, he clearly is speaking to God and asking God to possess him. In this holy sonnet, John Donne is not speaking to God, he's actually speaking to death. So similar to the English Renaissance poems, we see that it's dealing with one of those 5 great subjects of English Renaissance poetry. And technically, the term that we use to describe addressing something that is not alive and cannot respond, we call that an apostrophe. I tell my students to remember, that to address something begins with an A, and apostrophe begins with an A. It's not the punctuation mark in this case. It means to talk to something. So in this poem, John Donne is talking to death pretty much the entire time, although it's a holy sonnet, so he's going to refer to Christian iconography in his discussion with death. Now, the first thing we always ask is this Shakespearean or is this Petrarchan? Batter My Heart, Three-Person God was mostly Petrarchan, but let's look at the rhyme scheme here. Thee, so, overthrow me. Be, flow, go, delivery. So I see so, throw, flow, go, and I see thee, me, be, delivery. We are looking at a Petrarchan sonnet. That it has that ABBA rhyme scheme. Now, it does get a little messed up down here where we have men, dwell, well, then. That's CDDC, and then we have eternali and die. And so he has a CDDC, he has an EE rhyme couplet at the end. So again, John Donne's sort of messing around with the traditional rules of the sonnet. Maybe we could say he's a weak poet for that, or we could just say that he's accomplishing his purposes. But the poem is a meditation of death, on death, and it is an attempt to vanquish death. Death is always haunting all of poetry, death and beauty, and love, I suppose. And so he begins his poem very strongly by addressing death and giving it a command. Most people know the phrase, death be not proud. Again, we see immediately when you apostrophize something, you immediately personify it. Death is suddenly something that can be proud. And he's telling death that it's wrong to be proud. Death is so powerful, death is so dominant, death takes everybody that's alive. So he's like, you're so into yourself, you shouldn't be into yourself. And so it begs the question when we look at the whole sonnet, well, why shouldn't death be proud? What reasons do we have for that? And the poem is emotionally, invested in death is a very sad and terrible thing, and I'd like to vanquish it. But it kind of fights death with intellect for the most part, rather than being, I would say, a very emotional poem. Let's look at the structure of it in some ways. We have, the ABBA quatrain here. We have another quatrain here. I don't see a yet or a but where it traditionally is. We see that it's the sonnet's maybe a little unusual compared to things. We see that there's a sort of fourth quatrain. A question is repeated that kind of echoes the beginning. Why swellest thou then? Why are you proud, death? And then we have, I would say if there is a volta, it's here. We don't see a but or a yet. Instead, we just have a summary of the poem. And these are 3 arguments against death, so let's take a look at them. Donne says, death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. So most of this is just assertion rather than argument, right? He says, some people have called you mighty and dreadful, and we see these 3 words, proud, mighty, and dreadful, are sort of linguistically associated together. He just asserts you are not any of those things. You are not proud, mighty, or dreadful. Why are you not proud, mighty, and dreadful? Well, appealing to Christian theology, Donne says, those who you think you overthrow, the people who physically die, they actually don't die. And I want you to see the condescension here. This is a good place to talk about diction. Poor death. He's scornful. If we wanted to talk about the tone of this poem, one of them is scorn. He's filled with, scorn and condescension toward death. He says, those who you think you overthrow don't die, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. Now, he hasn't fully explained that. He's assuming that his audience, he wrote primarily for a Christian audience, that they would understand the doctrine of Christianity, that there's an afterlife and there's a resurrection, and that death does not rule or is not permanent in some ways. The second quatrain, he kind of gets into what I would call metaphorical argument. He likes to do this, sonnets like to do this a lot, where he compares death to its images. And we learn that rest and sleep are pictures of death. They look like death. When you're asleep, you aren't conscious and you sort of look like you're dead. It's not real death, it's just sort of the image of death. So he says, from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee much more must flow. He just sort of makes an argument by analogy. If rest and sleep give us pleasure, and they're just your images, then how much more pleasure must death itself actually give? He continues with his argument. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. So we see that he's using positive imagery here to sort of negate death's mighty, dreadful, and proud thing. Death creates pleasure. Death gives us rest of our bones and our soul's delivery, the physical side of death and the spiritual side of death. So he makes the metaphorical argument in sort of what I would call the intellectual portion of the poem. And then in the third part, he just resorts to what I would call pure insult, right? Like he just starts name-calling death. He says to death, thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Now, this is a good place to talk about syntax. Syntax is very difficult to talk about poetry, but it's word order. And we can see that the word order kind of diminishes or degrades as it goes down, right? Death kind of has to show up anytime somebody dies. So it is a slave to fate. Fate is kind of the grandest word in this list. And fate can kind of be called chance, which is kind of a degradation of it. There's fate, which seems like doom or ordained. And then there's chance, which is like, oh, well, it just kind of happened. We have kings, which are the most powerful men, and they decree an execution or something like that, and death has to show up and take the person. But we move from kings to desperate men, which sometimes students have interpreted as suicides, people who were desperate to sort of end their pain, or maybe thieves, crooks, robbers, highwaymen, desperate men who kill people to, steal a few coins. And in other words, you're not only a slave to kings, you're a slave to desperate men too. So he's getting increasingly insulting, and he's not done insulting death yet. He says, and thou dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. So you're a slave to everybody, and you hang out with losers that nobody wants to hang out with. And then he says, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. This is what we would just call drugs, right? Like we could take opium, poppy, or some sort of sleeping drug, anesthetic, and it makes us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? We could say that, if we were writing about this poem, that the repetition here increases Donne's scorn. He's sort of like smack-talking death in some ways and being even ruder to him. So we have three sort of attempts to kind of take out death and its pride. We don't have a strong volta, as I said, we just have to deal with whatever sonnet gives us. Instead, we have the metaphor of sleep, that death and sleep are often connected together. That's an image that comes from Paul in the Bible, but I'm sure it's also used by many other authors as well. Donne just really sort of sums up the issue. He says, one short sleep past, we wake eternally. This is sort of the downward motion. We sleep, then we wake. The sleep here is short, and it's contrasted with eternally. We see sort of a perfectly balanced line there. One short sleep past, the physical death, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. This is like the ultimate, stab in the back of death. That death is nothing and not powerful because death itself will have to kind of take its own medicine and end up dying. All this is predicated, of course, upon the truths of Christianity as Donne knew them. But it is an effective ending because he's saying the paradox that death can actually die. So a very filled poem with lots of metaphorical images and lots of different poetic devices. It begins with insult and asserts with triumph, right? It asserts that death is not proud or worth having any pride at the end of the poem. As for the most important word of the poem, it just depends on how you're feeling. But I think I just might go with proud. Because the whole poem is a takedown of pride, I would think. So a beautiful little poem, kind of got an angry and vicious tone, and it is a takedown of death.